There was an op-ed in the New York Times in the last few days, and it's by a professor by the name of Daniel Pollock Peltzner of One Linfield College. I'm not sure exactly where that institution is based. But anyway, in this New York Times op-ed, he has argued that there is a scene in the famous film Mary Poppins, which he argues is racist because it's depicting blackface. Now, the scene in question is when Mary and the children go up the chimney with Bert, played by Dick Van Dyke, and naturally covered in chimney soot. They're blackened. Their clothes are blackened. Their faces are blackened. What Pollock Peltzner argues is that by not removing the suit and by putting more on, that's blackfacing. Mary Poppins, of course, was played by the white actress Julie Andrews. Now, Mary Poppins is a much loved family film. I think it's fair to say that the whole story of Mary Poppins has become something of a British institution. And it's one of those things we think of. It's kind of a caricature of the United Kingdom. We think of, uh, I don't know, red telephone boxes, London double-decker buses, Mary Poppins, James Bond, Harry Potter, you name it. Anyway, there's a few things I want to say about this. The justification for this charge of racism is some obscure reference to the Admiral saying we need to shoot down those cheeky monkeys or something like that when they do the famous dance. Um, that's what Pollock Peltzner is arguing why it's racist in inverted commas. There, it doesn't surprise me that it's the New York Times that is giving him this platform. The New York Times get the gold medal in double standards when it comes to racism. Um, and a prominent recent example of that is they're giving a job to Sarah Jeong. It subsequently emerged, by the way, that Sarah Jeong, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but apparently it subsequently emerged that she was actually less than complimentary about the New York Times. So it's kind of ironic that they're giving a job to someone who was bad mouthing them shortly before. So, a little bit of a recap. Sarah Jeong is a Korean American so called journalist, um, and she attracted notoriety by, I think it was 2017, when she got this job at the New York Times, despite a series of very vitriolic and racist tweets emerging on her views on white people, the entire white race. And we're not talking about a little bit rude, we're talking about really hateful, basically genocidal comments. Among the charming things that she's come out with was if she saw, if she sees young white children with no hair, she hopes they have leukemia. She likes being cruel to old white men. Um, and there was another one about white people being in the sun. And anyway, this isn't like one ill judged comment where she had too much to drink and said something stupid. What we're talking about is a series of really hateful diatribes against an entire race. What does the New York Times do? They come out with some phony apology, and I say phony because they then went on to excuse her and find excuses for her. So their excuse was it was taken out of context, and she was responding to some trolls. But this is a very strange sort of explanation because I don't see how if let's say let me play the devil's advocate for a second. Let's say she had been had some sort of racist abuse or sexist abuse. How how do you win an argument by then just retorting with exactly the same sort of bigotry? I've never understood that how you defeat racism by being racist. It's just nonsense. So that was the excuse they used. And one aspect of the whole Sarah Jeong situation that I deeply resent is the way they framed it as angry right wingers. Well, I'm not particularly right wing. I'm certainly not a fan of President Trump. And I was angry about Sarah Jeong's attitude. Anyone with their head screwed on should be. And I will say that those white liberals who go out their way to defend her, It's the worst sort of virtue signaling moral cowardice, frankly. I say moral cowardice because it's not taking the responsibility of recognizing racism for what it is. And it's giving an Asian racist, Asian American racist, it's letting her off the hook solely because she is Asian American. Now, someone pointed out something I hadn't considered, but it's a good point. There were thousands, literally thousands, of white men whom she so disparages died. They died and they were wounded in the struggle for Korean liberation during the Korean War. Now, I appreciate she may have been born in the United States, but her heritage is Korean, and for her to then demonize white people is an insult to young white men, some of them in their early 20s, who died trying to liberate the land of her ancestors. And whilst you wouldn't usually get into that, your ancestors list, it does demonstrate something about her astonishing ignorance. But I find it sickening that a major publication rewards someone like this. So, to come back to the Mary Poppins thing, what the New York Times is doing is getting an extremely obscure situation that some professor has decided to dig into and find non existent racism. I mean, the point is, Mary Poppins, it's obvious. Her face is covered in soot. Soot is black. And even if you can find some obscure sort of reference that was maybe a little bit politically incorrect by today's standards, the fact that you have a major editorial, well, op ed, in a major publication shows you the real agenda of the New York Times. It's stirring up racial animosity. And the whole way they approached the Sarah Jeong incident was, and not just the New York Times, other left wing publications, they had it in inverted commas. Sarah Jeong's racism in inverted commas. I've even seen people come out with crap about the manufactured outrage, and they've tried to disparage the anger that was generated by her hateful tweets. I would say white people in particular who defend Sarah Jeong are useful idiots. I mean, they're just useful idiots. A racist is a racist is a racist. I don't care if you're white, black, Asian, or Hispanic or Arab. If you're coming out with racist views about an entire demographic, you are by definition a racist. Sarah Jeong is a racist. And I find it sickening that, I mean, put it this way, they're saying, oh, she was responding to trolls who had made sexist comments and so on. Well, what if the same excuse was used for a white supremacist? He or she was just responding to the F wing trolls. No, everyone has to be responsible for their own words and attitudes. She could have retorted, if there was indeed such trolls as has been claimed, she could have retorted in a smart way. She could have put them down in a different way. What does she do? She demonizes the entire white race. And the New York Times, which is run by moral cards, they defend her. And I find it utterly sickening, to be quite honest. What's more, Sarah Jeong has never ever shown remorse from that. Now, what we see in the West these days, particularly in the United States, but you see it in other societies as well, we see it in the UK as well, um, identity politics is, I can make a whole video about this subject in itself, but I'll try and round this up. I don't think that people kind of being aware of their demographic identity is necessarily a bad thing in itself. So I think it would be naive to say that, for example, an African American person isn't influenced by the history of African Americans. That would be naive. Of course, people are influenced by the history of their ancestors. But the thing I despise about identity politics is that by nature it is divisive. It tribalizes people. It makes people constantly have a chip on their shoulder. So anything that goes wrong in life, oh well, it must be the fault of the the white establishment, or it must be the fault of men, or it must be the fault of straight people. And my goodness, if you're a white, straight, heterosexual man, then you're enemy number one to these people who just want to seek division. I don't think America is going to go forward until people start looking at other people as individuals instead of demographics, like men or women or straight or gay or you name it. So when you see the likes of CNN and the New York Times and other publications and media outlets, the way they deal with racial issues is by promoting a victimhood narrative. Now, I am not saying that there's not a problem with racism in America. I'm not saying that there aren't white supremacists out there. There are. And they need to be called out, they need to be condemned. But what the likes of CNN and the New York Times does is they then morph that into being the entire white race. So they take some neo Nazi who admires Hitler and they morph that into saying, okay, not all white people think like that, but all white people are part of the problem. So it's a very, very toxic agenda. And I'll tell you something right now. I treat all people as individuals. I give everyone the benefit of the doubt. I mean, put it this way, I despise the Russian government and what it's doing to my country. But if I met a Russian person, I'm not going to be hostile to them just because they're Russian. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. If they come out as a Putinist and they come out with nationalistic attitudes, then, I'll take issue with them. But I treat people as individuals. Surely that's what every reasonable person should do. Now, when a hatemonger, and that's what she is, like Sarah Jeong, is promoted and protected and excused, it actually lends itself to what is going on here. It is insufferable double standards. And when white people understandably get pissed off by this, then how does the New York Times respond? With patronizing attitudes about, oh, well, they're angry right wingers, they're angry white men. Well, that insults white women as well. It insults all white people. And I know of reasonable centre left people who were also angry about that. So them framing it as like, oh, it's just a bunch of angry gun toting Trump supporters, that's nonsense. If you have your head screwed on right, any white person should be angry about that. Because her attacks was on the entire white race. I mean, just imagine for a second a white writer in a major publication made disparaging remarks about all Asians. Well, we don't have to imagine. Think of that incident on the Jimmy Kimmel show about 6 years ago, where a kid said, "Kill all Chinese people." It was obviously an insulting thing to say, but that was a child. Jimmy Kimmel apologized several times, but you had angry protests on the streets from Chinese Americans, and that's an example of the double standards. You're either against racism as a whole, or you're a hypocrite. So those people who defend Sarah Jeong and say, oh, well, they were badly judged comments or they were taken out of context, but then you're the first to get your pitchfork out about white racism, you're part of the problem because you're not being consistent and you're demonstrating, you're promoting double standards that only seek to divide and create more animosity. Anyway, I can make a whole video about identity politics because I think it is a massive problem. I think it is toxic. Because what it does is it puts people into this frame of mind where they don't look at other people. I mean, Sarah Jeong's clearly a very bitter individual. She clearly looks at white people as the enemy. So a white person can make a groveling, they can grovel to her and agree with her, but she clearly has animosity towards the entire white race. A bit like third wave feminists have animosity towards men. It's inbuilt. Like, oh, you're saying that because you're a man, you're mansplaining. Or white supremacists, they have the same mentality. It's like anyone who's not white is my enemy, and it's those people and my people. and then certain misogynists as well. You get it within, particularly within Islam, but you do get misogynists outside Islam as well. And they have this attitude that they have ownership of women. And my point is, you can find this sort of regressive thinking in any demographic. And I just wish people would be more open minded and just see people as individuals. So when the New York Times promotes this garbage, when they try to divide people by creating controversies where there are none, I mean, they're elevating this professor who is a nobody, but they're elevating him into a somebody. And they're, promoting his attempt to divide people. I've heard people respond to this and say, "Oh, academia is under attack," but it isn't far left academics like this who are under attack. It's people like Professor Jordan Peterson who have ideas that don't conform to the identity politics mantra. They're the ones who are truly under attack, and you get these people like Professor, forgot his name now, but who try to stir up animosity, who try to create. I mean, this thing about blackfacing, I understand why it's controversial. The Mary Poppins scene was not blackfacing. There's a controversy going on now with Governor Northam in Virginia. I mean, well, that's an example. He's had to make an apology. There's demands for him to step down because apparently he blacked up for Michael Jackson. Now, I don't think white people should black up. I think it's very naive, particularly in the current climate. I don't. Although it has to be said, those pictures were from 1984, talking over 30 years ago. And with all the problems facing the African American community, with poverty, with crime, with issues around relationships with the police, all those issues, people try to find the most obscure things and turn it into a massive issue. So if you're really worried, excuse me, more worried about so-called blackfacing in a film from 1964 than you are about young black men dying every single day on the streets of Chicago. You need to get your priorities right. And I'll leave it there. Shame on the New York Times. I think their agenda is pathetic. I think they're moral cards because they will not be consistent. And I think it's a damn disgrace that they enable a hate monger like Sarah Jeong.